How's it going, everybody? So we have a fun review today as we're talking Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver. It's definitely fascinating looking at the contrast as far as hype back when Part 1, A Child of Fire, came out, compared to now with Part 2, The Scargiver. I mean, sure, Part 1 wasn't that well received critically or even audience score-wise. Personally, for me at least, I enjoyed Part 1 for the most part, but it definitely had its faults. It just feels so weird to me that in comparison, it seems like Netflix doesn't care as much about promoting Part 2. As Korra and the surviving warriors prepare to defend Velt, the warriors face their past, revealing their motivations before the realm's forces arrive to crush the growing rebellion. Being as this movie is a Part 2 after all, you would think that the initial setup for everything is out of the way, but yet oddly, Part 2 manages to spend quite a bit of time attempting to flesh out the group of rebels to more or less mixed results by its conclusion. If Part 1 of Rebel Moon was Zack Snyder's Star Wars, Part 2 by and large is definitely Seven Samurai. Very much so taking a similar approach to structure of that story, preparing the people of this farm, training them all in preparation for an inevitable showdown against the Mother World. There definitely still is a lot here that feels reminiscent to Star Wars, but I definitely got much more Seven Samurai vibes out of any other references. And due to the way that this film is structured, I would say more or less the first hour or so of Part 2 is spent laying the groundwork for a larger bombastic second hour of non-stop action. This first hour, we're trying to dig a bit deeper into these characters, their experiences with the Mother World, and why they're fighting and rebelling. The exposition isn't done in a very creative fashion. It essentially boils down to all of them sitting around a table and going through a multitude of flashbacks, trauma dumping for 15 minutes on their traumatic past. It's the film's greatest attempt at trying to get you invested in these characters, and it's basically the only time you're going to feel that throughout the entire film's runtime. Since otherwise, most of the cast here assembled are pretty cool characters that each get very badass moments when the action does kick into gear, most of them do come off kind of hollow other than a few choice examples. Via Patella, I think much like in Part 1, is the major standout of the entire cast. Here in Part 2, we continue to learn more about Korra's horrific backstory, her history with the slain king, continuing to fuel her grudge against Admiral Noble, and fuels the fire for the battle at hand, given that he actually survived their encounter at the end of Part 1. I will say though, the uneven shortcomings of the first hour of Rebel Moon Part 2 do levy into an exhilarating second hour, which truly does deliver as far as awesome out of this world sci-fi spectacle is concerned. I'd even argue that the over-the-top intensity of this part of the movie is one of the film's biggest strengths, since once this battle does begin, it's an unrelenting war with a vast amount of creativity putting into keeping that momentum high all throughout. There's even a lot of big surprises in this battle. There are some characters that I for sure thought were going to make it out alive that don't. As amazing as the majority of these action sequences are, there was one scene in particular that I kind of laughed at to myself, and it's not even the movie's fault or anything. There's just one particular battle between two characters that perfectly replicated the meme from the first Avatar film. Once you see the movie, you'll know exactly which scene I'm referring to. Certain sections of the action do stand out more than others. Nemesis, in particular, has one of my favorite battles, fitting very in theme with the Seven Samurai inspiration, except for this time they have lightsaber-like weapons. Jimmy, who was one of my personal MVPs of Part 1, despite his limited screen time, doesn't have a lot to work with even in Part 2, but the screen time he does get in this, especially when he causes some mayhem, one of the true highlights of everything that we watch in Part 2. Honestly though, the final battle between Admiral Noble and Korra is the best battle of the entire film. It's just pure madness, this colored bladed duel across a ship while it's falling out of the sky. Pure heavy metal madness at its finest. Though what's so unfortunate about Part 2, particularly in a lot of the big battle sequences, is that it's so clearly evident that most of these sequences, they are holding back a lot due to the whole director's cut stuff. There's many different points of the film where it just feels like the story just has big chunks cut out of it, similar to back in Part 1. Due to the fact that this is a PG-13 film, it's a pretty bloodless movie, though it's just an onslaught of mayhem for the last hour. We're watching people explode, arms are getting chopped off, heads are getting chopped off, and you see basically none of it. They either completely cut it out of the scene entirely, or you see about a half second of it before they cut away, which is a very frustrating experience as an audience member, because that's stuff that you definitely want to see. And it sucks that they're holding back on stuff like that, because you know a director's cut is going to be more brutal, is coming down the road. Obviously, it's just speculation until Zack Snyder and Netflix release the director's cuts, but it seems like a lot of the stuff they cut out of it, other than the violence, is a good amount of the plot progression and the character arcs. Things that you would expect in a movie to get you invested in these characters. So many of these characters, I do find things about them genuinely intriguing, and I desperately want to know more about them, but the film almost actively refuses to let me get attached to them or know a whole lot about them. Between part 1 and part 2, we set up this cool ragtag team of rebels going up against the mother world, but they don't interact a whole lot other than a couple scenes here and there, building up a little bit of camaraderie, but there's not enough of it to really understand the dynamics between these characters or build a lot of chemistry. So I have to imagine a lot of that is cut out of the film entirely. By the end of the movie, while they're setting up a new adventure for a part 3 and a new team, I still feel like I don't know too much about some of these characters, even though they've been in, what, 4 hours of screen time between part 1 and part 2. Honestly, I probably wouldn't even put a lot of blame on the performances, because I like most of the cast. Some of them stand out more than others. I think the biggest standout, much like in part 1, is Sofia Boutella as Cora. Continues to anchor this film as a badass leader with some interesting new layers to explore. Though once again, Djimon Hounsou didn't get a big amount of screen time here. I think his screen time was better utilized in this. The short instances where he fleshed out his backstory are riveting to me. Seeing this man who's torn up so much by guilt because he got his men killed. And even someone like Ed Skrein, who I think continues to be a delightfully wicked, unhinged villain. I think he steps up his game in part 2 to be even more unhinged than ever before, trying to kill Cora. Things like these are tricky, as they are things that we see in a variety of Zack Snyder films, because the film still is packed with your usual Zack Snyder-isms that by now I don't know why you'd be expecting otherwise. It's the usual pros. His style continues to be gorgeous from a cinematic standpoint. From a visual standpoint, it's frustrating that we can't watch this on the biggest screen possible, because the VFX work here is absolutely phenomenal. More or less, I would say he gives you the exact things that you would want if you're a big fan of him. His tropes, if you will. The biggest one that everybody always talks about is these slow motion fight sequences, which I would at least say for the most part they are entertaining and they're not overly egregious. More often than not, for me at least, when it comes to Zack Snyder and his uses of slow-mo. The action sequences, I think for the most part it's fine, but when he starts using slow-mo for a bunch of other random things, the biggest example of that I found to be kind of absurd in part 2 is the overabundance of slow motion harvesting of grain. For the first half an hour or so of the movie, the rebels are helping these people farm out grain, and there's a lot of slow motion shots in it, and I don't really understand why. Besides that though, one of the cons I often find watching Zack Snyder's films, even in the ones that I enjoy, is when it comes to his character work, I feel like at times it can kind of feel secondary in the sake of other areas of the film. You certainly could attest that to the whole director's cut versus theatrical cuts in some instances. To me personally, it just seems kind of weird to build out an entire new franchise but not really flesh out the world all that much or the characters that inhabit it, but you still want people to get invested in what you're trying to craft. Fleshing out the world and the characters that inhabit it is kind of like one of the #1 rules in building a sci-fi universe. Who knows though, it seems like Zack Snyder has a lot of different ideas in mind as far as films go. It'll be very interesting to see if a lot of that stuff comes to fruition or what ideas he has spinning. If Rebel Moon Part 1, A Child of Fire, didn't sell you on the world, I don't really believe that Part 2 will move the needle all that much. There's absolutely things to enjoy creatively and stylistically. From an action standpoint, I do think the film is stellar in that regard, but I did hope for a little bit better character work here to enhance the experience and invest me more in this being a long-term franchise on Netflix. Like I said earlier, the ending does set up a potential Part 3 with these characters, so it's gonna be really interesting what the reception to Part 2 is on if audiences do want a Part 3 to this. But also the other major thing is the director's cuts that Zack Snyder and Netflix are gonna put out eventually, and how is that going to damper the overall experience, because there's probably a lot of people that are not going to watch these movies because they're just going to wait to watch Zack Snyder's director's cuts whenever those come out on Netflix, and he's talking about how different they are to the ones that we're getting now. Hope it doesn't shoot him in the foot that he's saying things like this on the press tour, or a bunch of people are not going to watch this because of stuff he says like that. But once you get a chance to check out Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver, make sure you share your thoughts down below. What'd you think of the film? Did you like the film? Did you not like the film? Do you want a Part 3? Do you not want a Part 3? Either way, make sure you share your thoughts down below, because part of the fun is that conversation with you guys in the comments section. Thank you guys, as always, for checking out the videos. I always do appreciate it. Make sure you like on the video and also subscribe to the channel to see update reviews, reactions, unboxings, and more. For the next time, I'll see you guys later.